IndyPram, yes, IndyPram on IndyLive.Radio. IndyPram, yes, IndyPram on IndyLive.Radio.
Welcome to the IndyPram Podcast on Independence Live Radio. Scotland the Brief by Gordon MacIntyre-Kemp, Part 6. Brexit. Why it's a problem for Scotland and why it's a problem for you. This is a chapter of the book that I hoped I wouldn't need to write, but Brexit is now inevitable. Before we look at the economics of Brexit, let's consider the political position. Business for Scotland led the business arm of the 2016 Remain campaign in Scotland, with 62% voting to stay in the EU. Since then, chaos has reigned. The UK is on its third Prime Minister, technically fifth if you count Theresa May and Boris Johnson as standing twice each, and it is only now, with the government of Boris Johnson in place, that we can start to predict with any confidence that Brexit will actually take place. The UK government now has one single overriding priority: to take the UK out of the EU on the 31st of January 2020. However, what we can't be sure of is what form Brexit will take. We have 1 year for the UK and the EU to negotiate a trade deal, and even before you consider how poorly the negotiations have been handled by the UK government, 1 year is not enough time. Comprehensive trade deals tend to take between 5 and 7 years to complete. However, assuming the UK maintains full regulatory alignment with the EU, it certainly could be a quicker process. Still, I have met no trade experts who believe such a trade deal can be done within a year. The most likely outcome, given the time constraints, is that a series of mini trade deals will be done in priority areas, and with every deal the UK government will be able to claim a small victory. The UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, however, now has a majority and is a highly pragmatic politician. Unlike his predecessor or his own pre-2019 general election government, he now has majority support within his own party and therefore cannot be held to ransom by the anti-EU wing of the Conservatives, nor the DUP. And this could end up looking like what used to be referred to as a softer Brexit. This would allow him to get Brexit done but also appeal to the worried Remain voters. That said, there is still a strong possibility that the trade deals will fail, and so at the end of the 2020 transition period, a no-deal Brexit could still happen. The key thing to remember from a Scottish economics point of view is that Scotland's goods exports are double per head of the rest of the UK. Whisky alone represents 21% of the UK's food and drink exports. Scotland is the only nation in the UK with a positive trade balance in goods since records began, and our oil and gas exports and related services exports are worth over £9.25 billion. This means that there has never been any such thing as a soft Brexit for Scotland. During the Scottish independence referendum, a key No campaign message was that an independent Scotland would not be able to join the EU. A campaigning message tweeted by the No campaign on September 2nd, 2014, summed up their argument precisely. What is the process for removing our EU citizenship? Voting yes. Scotland voted no in 2014, but the wish to remain in the EU was clearly a major driver of that result. So, for Scotland to be removed from the EU in the face of a 62% Remain vote has reopened the constitutional debate. The 2019 general election in Scotland was a pseudo-referendum of Scottish independence, albeit conducted by a first-past-the-post electoral system. The SNP manifesto pledge on independence means that the Scottish Parliament has a mandate to hold an independence referendum once the UK has left the EU. Therefore, the Scottish Government is demanding the right to hold a Scottish independence referendum in the current term of the Scottish Parliament, which ends in May 2021. Theresa May's fallback position was now is not the time. This is because she knew that politically, morally, and possibly even legally, she could not say no. Boris Johnson has now officially denied the Scottish First Minister's request. Therefore, it seems he will end up in court fighting with many of his ministers already privately admitting it's inevitable. The UK will leave the EU on January the 31st, 2020. As the UK will no longer be a member, EU MEPs and EU governments will then be able to openly voice support for Scotland rejoining the EU and begin to discuss plans for that to happen openly. That in itself will change the international dynamic of any independence campaign versus 2014. Now let us look at why Brexit will be especially bad news for the Scottish economy. Economic impact of Brexit. Many banks forecast that the pound will decrease in value even to parity with the dollar. Recession. Dependent on whether there is a trade deal or a no-deal Brexit, there is a potential for Scotland and the rest of the UK to be pushed into recession in 2021, 22, 23. Using an average of predictions, the Scottish economy will contract by 5% in the year following a hard Brexit, which is still possible if the trade deal negotiations fail. And that is a conservative figure. Note that in the year of the oil price crash, Scotland managed to avoid a recession. The onshore economy actually grew by 1.6%. Increased unemployment. The economic slowdown could more than double the rate of Scottish unemployment to around 8%. Currently, the Scottish unemployment rate is 3.7% and the UK sits at 3.8%. To be clear, that would mean up to 100,000 people in Scotland losing their jobs. A fall in investment. As already referred to in this book, Scotland's foreign direct investment grew by 7% in 2017. This was a key driver of growth and higher than for the UK as a whole. The number of headquarters in Scotland is at a decade high, and Scotland is now the second most attractive place to invest in the UK, behind only London. However, analysis by the Bank of England suggests that foreign direct investment into the UK would fall by around 20% over the coming years, under a no-deal scenario, and still significantly but less sharply if trade deals are agreed. Brexit will therefore undermine another key plank of Scotland's economic success. Higher prices. The Bank of England has forecast that the cost of living would rise in the event of a no-deal Brexit, possibly by as much as 6.5% in 2021. Food prices could rise by up to 10%. The managing director of Birdseye has said that some food prices could rise by up to 20%. The pound sinks. The value of the pound in your pocket will change dramatically. It already has, with sterling hitting a 2-year low against the dollar. Sterling was worth $2 just before the 2007 credit crunch, but fell to $1.44 after the crash, and then again to $1.21 in 2016 following the Brexit vote. Recently, the pound has been volatile within the range of $1.24 to $1.31. However, it will yo-yo for a while due to the Brexit uncertainty. Likewise, the highest this has ever been against the euro was €1.75 in the year 2000, but it has recently ranged between €1.10 and €1.21. The pound is no longer strong nor stable. Many banks forecast that the pound will decrease in value after Brexit, and some, such as Morgan Stanley, suggest it will reach parity with the dollar in the event of a no-deal Brexit. This will have serious consequences. The Institution for Fiscal Studies estimated that the 2007-2008 depreciation of the pound, resulting from the financial crisis, led to food prices rising by 8.7% relative to other goods. It is not unreasonable to suggest the same increase may happen again. It is also not unreasonable to add as much as another 10 to 15% to that, as there will be tariffs on food imports, on top of the sterling devaluation, which did not exist in 2007 and 2008. What we can be sure of is that Brexit will make holidays outside of the UK more expensive. The cost of living will go up. By how much is dependent on what type of Brexit happens. This, added to the reduction in real wages, will mean people will be significantly worse off than they would have been without Brexit. Shortages. Currently, trade with the EU is paperless and there are no physical customs checks. This means trade can flow through Dover in particular very easily between the EU and the UK. Any weakening to those customs agreements, which would include non-physical barriers to trade such as increased paperwork and checks, and the lack of additional port capacity needed to deal with that, would or could cause a bottleneck effect at ports in the south of England. It is universally accepted that this would result in prioritisation of certain goods. Luxury goods, such as starfruit and avocado, French cheeses and fresh-cut flowers, may have to be deprioritised compared to essential foodstuffs. Much of what we eat is imported. All haricot beans used to make baked beans are imported, as are many other household name products such as bird's eye fish fingers. Not so much of a problem, you might think, but 90% of UK medicines are also imported, and of that 45% are from the EU. Vital life-saving medicines such as insulin are not made in the UK. The core ingredients for many medicines are produced in India and the Far East, and delays at ports will risk lives. No government is capable of reinventing an entire medicine supply chain from scratch in a decade, never mind almost instantaneously as a no-deal Brexit demands. In total, the UK imports 40% of the food it eats. 30% from the EU and 10% from other nations, through deals enabled by EU membership. Out of season, the UK imports from the EU as much as 70% of its soft fruit, 80% of its tomatoes, and 90% of its lettuce. The UK also imports 60% of its bacon and 50% of mushrooms. Rice, for example, is not grown in the UK, yet 90% of UK households consume rice regularly. So, on top of the cost of food increasing significantly, you may not even be able to buy some of the foods you normally eat, or access some of the prescription drugs you need immediately following Brexit. Had the Brexit deal negotiated by former Prime Minister Theresa May been enacted, there would have been a 21-month transition period to sort out such issues. But that is not the case with a no-deal Brexit on December the 31st, 2020, which is the legal default position voted on by the UK Parliament. EU funding. This is vital to Scotland. For the period 2014 to 2020, Scotland will receive £476 million from the European Regional Development Fund to assist in improving infrastructure. The European Social Fund added £464 million to tackle poverty, unemployment and invest in vocational skills improvements. Some 73% of Scottish farms will become insolvent without the Common Agricultural Policy payments, which could devastate Scotland's rural economy. In fact, due to Westminster's policy of overinvestment and centralisation of wealth around London and the South East, parts of the UK such as Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, and some Northern English regions qualify for EU grant aid that England as a whole does not. Scotland pays only 8.4% of the UK's EU membership fee but receives 17.4% of the EU funding to the UK. The net annual benefit of EU membership to the Scottish tax take is £2.1 billion. The UK is clearly in no position to replace that. Does Brexit mean that the UK will benefit from increased sovereignty? The EU operates a single market and customs union, which means that trade between member nations is without tariffs and is free of other trade barriers such as customs checks. Financial and other services can also be traded throughout the EU without restriction. If a nation leaves, it loses access to the single market, and the EU's 4 freedoms for goods, services, capital and people no longer apply. A key Brexit argument was that the net gain of leaving is in regaining full sovereignty. Yet the UK already has full sovereignty. In order to join the EU in the first place, a nation must be fully sovereign. Being an EU member necessitates full sovereign independent nation status. It does not negate it. All member states of the EU are therefore sovereign nations. They have not lost any sovereignty. They simply exercise that full sovereignty to align their rules and regulations with other EU members and to facilitate greater and easier trade through more equalised market conditions. This prevents a nation with lesser standards, and therefore much lower costs, flooding the single market with cheaper products. That also benefits the UK. So, all the sacrifices that Brexit entails are to regain full sovereignty, but that is not actually something the UK has ever lost. All the UK really gains from Brexit is the requirement to renegotiate all the trade deals that the UK currently enjoys as a benefit of its EU membership. However, it will only be able to offer access to a 66 million person market as a negotiation leverage, compared to access to a 508 million person market, offered when the EU negotiates on the UK's behalf. So who has lost sovereignty? To believe that Brexit is a good thing, or that Scotland will benefit from a Brexit in the face of a rapidly growing mountain of data which proves that any sort of Brexit is a monumental act of self-harm, is to suspend all critical thinking ability and replace it with a dogmatic, almost cultish adherence to the mantra of British nationalism. I am a Northumbrian Scot and an internationalist, and if Scotland were an independent sovereign nation, my priority would be to use that sovereignty to rejoin the single market either through full EU or EFTA membership. However, without that independence, Scotland's interests don't count. The fact that Brexit is happening demonstrates the phenomenon known as the democratic deficit, where votes cast in Scotland do not impact on the rest of the UK elections and referendums. As the population of the rest of the UK, and England in particular, is so much larger than that of Scotland. Scotland voted 62% to remain in the EU referendum, but that vote was overwhelmed by the large Leave vote in the rest of the UK. Consider a parallel. A local council is planning on spending £100,000 on street lighting on one of 2 streets, and that the investment will increase property values. The council holds a public meeting to vote for which street gets the better lighting. 10 householders live on Street A, and 80 live on Street B. Whose interest would you expect to be favoured? It's obvious, and it so naturally follows that Westminster, with 533 English MPs and only 59 Scottish MPs, will not prioritise Scotland's interests. That's not a contentious statement, nor is it something to get upset about. It's not even Scottish nationalism, it's just math. If you want the maths to favour Scotland, you simply need to move all the required powers from Westminster to Holyrood. Observations. In what must go down in history as a moment of political madness, the UK is about to rip up all of its trade deals and try to renegotiate those deals from a comparative position of weakness. Those new deals will therefore be significantly worse than the ones it already enjoys through EU membership. It is also going to attempt to do this simultaneously and instantaneously, when trade deals usually take between 5 and 7 years to complete, and the UK has no real expertise in negotiating trade deals, as the EU has been doing it for them for more than 40 years. The UK has a government that is dedicated to a course of action that will raise the cost of living exponentially, raise unemployment, cut investment, create food and medicine shortages, and sink its currency. You almost couldn't make this up. Against all of that, your loss of EU citizens' rights, restrictions to your freedom of movement, no European health card whilst on holiday, queues at airports rather than going through the EU citizens lane, and mobile phone roaming charges coming back when you are abroad seem almost inconsequential. Yet those were key arguments against Scotland's independence in 2014. You might not have voted to leave the British Union in 2014, but if Scotland were an independent nation now, would you vote to join it? Scotland's finances. Now you have a better understanding of Scotland's economy, let's look at its finances. It's remarkably clear from the evidence of earlier chapters that Scotland has everything it takes to be an extremely prosperous and successful independent nation. This prompts the question, why does an oil-rich nation with a strong and resilient onshore economy, booming exports, a highly educated population, low unemployment, a wide range of key economic sectors, have a set of accounts that suggests that Scotland's finances are weak? This is a trick question. It doesn't. There is no set of accounts that tells us how an independent Scotland's economy would fare, nor what its finances would look like. Any attempt to analyse Scotland's finances is instantly hampered by the fact that Scotland is not an independent nation, and therefore does not have the same financial data, trade statistics, costs and revenue information available to work with that a normal independent country would have. We do have a set of financial reports called GERS, Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland. This tells us about Scotland's finances as a region of the UK, but importantly tells us next to nothing about what Scotland's finances would look like were it already an independent nation. Of the 26 income figures quoted in GERS, 25 are estimated, and there are no fully reliable Scottish-specific income tax, corporation tax, VAT or national insurance figures. So GERS does not even really indicate what Scotland's financial position is today as part of the UK, and it most definitely does not tell us what Scotland's finances would be after independence had been achieved. That is stated clearly and repeatedly in every GERS report. The fact that GERS is a set of accounts for Scotland as a region of the UK and not a separate nation impacts on how the GERS figures are compiled. This is important to know for three reasons. 1. It means that multiple UK-wide costs are applied to Scotland's expenditure in GERS which are not controlled by the Scottish Government, and therefore many of the major expenditures reported in GERS are actually under the control of the UK Government. These costs are nominally applied to Scotland's GERS report as a population percentage of the UK's expenditure. This happens regardless of where the expenditure was applied, which government spent the money, and without any reference to where the economic benefit of any expenditure accrued. Thus, Scotland's costs are deliberately inflated and its true economic performance deflated. 2. Several of the key areas, such as oil and gas taxation, corporation tax and VAT, are controlled by the UK Government, which can make decisions that significantly lower or raise Scotland's income without any reference to the Scottish Government. 3. Even with these issues having a drag effect on the Scottish economy, GERS have shown that for 38 years in a row, Scotland had higher GDP per head and lower illustrative deficits as a percentage of GDP. The last 4 years, where the GERS illustrative deficit has been higher than the UK's, relate to the UK Government's decision to lower taxes on oil extraction and thus lower Scottish revenues. So if Scotland's economy performs better than the UK's on average, but GERS shows a deficit, GERS must contain clear evidence of mechanisms for removing wealth from Scotland's accounts to create a phony deficit. GERS does, and we will look at that after we take a brief snapshot of what GERS says. Scotland's finances as part of the UK. Let's take a look at the actual figures from the 2017-2018 GERS report before we analyse some of the accounting practices that hide Scotland's wealth. According to GERS, Scotland generated revenues of £59.957 billion. The UK Treasury received most of those revenues, while the Scottish Government retained some revenues related to the new Scottish income tax bands and other devolved taxes such as land and buildings tax. Scottish Government expenditure is calculated by the UK Chancellor, who sets a budget for England based on the bids by the UK ministerial departments. The Scottish Government and the Welsh and the Northern Ireland Assemblies are then allocated a block grant, which is essentially a population percentage share of the UK budget. This is calculated by applying population share of the changes in devolved areas versus the previous year's baseline block grant. In 2017-2018, the Scottish Government's expenditure was £42.847 billion. Of that, it has the powers to decide policy fully on £26.761 billion. Some of the £14.449 billion is spent by local government, and £1,637 billion by public corporations, for example, Scottish Water. Some local government and public corporation spending is ring-fenced for specific purposes, public pensions, for instance. The Scottish Government must always balance its budget and cannot overspend. The Scottish Government can, however, borrow up to £600 million per year for cash management and forecasting errors, but only since February 2016. The UK Government declared that it spent £30.550 billion on Scotland's behalf in 2017-2018, thus increasing spending to £73.398 billion. This then creates an overall illustrative deficit, including the UK Government spending of £13.440 billion. That £13.440 billion is then described as Scotland's deficit, or in the mainstream media as Scotland's financial black hole. The main issue here isn't the deficit, but that, crucially, not all UK government spending on Scotland's behalf reaches Scotland, nor does it all benefit Scotland economically. Some of that £13.440 billion illustrative deficit is spent in and does not benefit Scotland, but it is essential to understand that when it doesn't, the spending is allocated to GERS, while the revenue generated as a result of spending are allocated to the accounts of other UK regions. GERS therefore presents a picture of a UK region, with a larger deficit than any true set of accounts for Scotland as an independent nation would. In other words, GERS, despite being a useful set of data, does not represent the financial reality of Scotland's economy, nor suggest how it would fare as an independent nation. Here's how it's done. There are four main ways in which the wealth is removed from Scotland. Debt loading. Loading the Scottish accounts with interest payments on a debt that Scotland did not generate and did not need. The Croydon Principle. UK government expenditure outside of Scotland being applied to Scotland's expenditure, but the economic benefits of that spending accrue elsewhere in the UK, not in Scotland. The Barnett formula myth exploded. It does not subsidise Scotland. Westminster economic mismanagement. As an example, the UK government's management of North Sea oil and gas compared with how Norway managed its revenues. How debt loading works. There is an expenditure line in GERS called Public Sector Debt Interest, PDSI. It's the sixth largest expenditure of the Scottish Government and a larger spend than Scotland's allocated share of the UK Armed Forces expenditure. Historical analysis of GERS reports demonstrates that every year since records began, Scotland has been paying interest on a population share of the UK's debts. In the last 5 years, 2014 to 2019, PSDI has added £16.2 billion, an average of £3.241 billion per year to the cost of running Scotland. That's not paying back the capital on any debt, it's just the interest on the UK's debt. Scotland has recently been granted very limited borrowing powers, but while the UK's debt was being built up, Scotland had no borrowing powers. In fact, Scotland's economy was either in surplus or had a lower deficit than the UK, so Scotland did not contribute to the creation of the debt. How does a nation without the ability to borrow end up paying billions of interest on debt every year? It does so because the allocation of the debt is not related to the UK region or nation which generated the debt, nor where the money was spent or the economic benefits felt. The UK's debt is allocated to Scotland's account on a population percentage basis, even though Scotland did not generate that debt. Looking at Scotland's GERS reports that go back 39 years, Scotland's share of UK debt interest amounted to a staggering £126 billion. However, analysing those figures also demonstrates that had Scotland been an independent country, its entire borrowing requirement over those 39 years would have been zero. Nothing. Not one penny. Scotland's accounts have had £126,000 million of interest on debts that Scotland did not generate nor benefit from, removed from them simply because it is not an independent country and had to chip in to service the rest of the UK's rising debts. Without that £126 billion cost, Scotland's finances would be in a surplus today. If we look back as far as reliable historical figures for Scotland's revenues and expenditures go, we can see that in 1980-1981, before the UK debt started to spiral, Scotland was charged £2.9 billion to service the UK debt. But despite that, it managed to record a surplus of more than £1 billion. Indeed, using GERS, Scotland's finances showed a surplus until 1990, when the cumulative surplus amounted to £38.1 billion. It's actually £72.6 billion surplus without debt loading. It is undeniable that in an independent Scotland those surpluses would either have been invested to grow Scotland's economy or possibly put into a sovereign wealth fund such as Norway's. Let's explore three alternative scenarios for how an independent Scotland could manage its finances. Scenario 1. What actually happened as part of the UK? Scotland was part of the UK, and so Scottish surpluses went to the UK Treasury. Scotland was actually subsidising the UK. Over time, the burden of the UK debt payments on Scotland's economy started to weigh it down. This meant that the surpluses falsely looked like they declined during the 1990s, and the cumulative surpluses were eaten up by UK debt-related deficits. As a result, the GERS reports now shows a cumulative phony deficit of £170.5 billion. The UK debt is a mind-blowing £1,821.3 billion, equivalent to 85.2% of GDP. Let's be clear, UK debts have been growing steadily over those 38 years. Any budget allocated to Scotland in that time that is of a higher value than Scotland's revenues is not a subsidy, it's a loan that Scotland has to pay the interest on. A loan that Scotland only seemed to need because it was subsidising the rest of the UK. It is a fact that as an independent nation, Scotland would have possessed those cumulative surpluses of £72.6 billion and could have chosen to reinvest in Scotland's economy, which would have grown the economy faster. An independent Scotland would not have accrued the £126 billion of debt interest charges, as it would not have needed any debts of its own. This is why you can't use GERS as an argument against independence. There is one massive flaw in the way GERS works. Allocating interest charges on debt that Scotland did not generate allows GERS to show a deficit, as it assumes that those surpluses disappeared into thin air. And that could not have happened. It is an undeniable fact that in an independent Scotland, those surpluses would either be invested to grow Scotland's economy or possibly put into a sovereign wealth fund for the future benefits of our nation, as Norway has done. Scenario 2. What's the daftest thing Scotland could have done? Assuming that an independent Scotland would not have gifted its massive surpluses to another country so that the other country could pay down its debts, what is the lowest rate of return an independent Scotland could have received on those 1980 surpluses? What if an independent Scotland's government had been so daft, so absolutely incompetent, that it could not figure out how to invest those massive surpluses, and as a result did nothing with them, but stuffed them into a bank and let them gain interest at the standard market rate? Even then, that government would have had to have constantly made significant worse economic decisions and more mistakes than Westminster did in running Scotland's economy to not see significant growth and better finances compared to being part of the UK. What if we also assume the worst, and that even without those debt interest payments holding Scotland's economy back, Scottish Government revenues didn't rise and that the economy grew much more slowly than other European nations with comparable populations? What would have happened? Well, those cumulative surpluses plus standard bank rates of interest would have topped out at £410.3 billion cash reserves in the bank in 2008-2009. And then started to fall till we had £337.7 billion in the bank today. Yeah, that's right. The daftest thing Scotland could have done as an independent nation would have left Scotland at least £508 billion better off today than Gers currently falsely suggests Scotland is, as part of the UK. However, had the government of the independent Scotland simply copied Norway, then Scotland would now be £943.56 billion better off than Gers suggests, and its false deficit tries to say we are in the UK today. £508 billion is missing from Scotland's economy from the practice of debt loading alone, and upon that accounting trick rests the entire economic case for the Union. Scenario 3. What would Norway have done? Let's assume Scotland's government just banked the early surpluses until it noticed Norway was starting an oil fund and decided to copy it. Applying the same annual rates of return that Norway received on its investments since 1998-1999, Scotland's National Oil Wealth Fund would now be worth £773 billion. Remember that Norway is a small to medium-sized, independent, northern European nation with roughly the same population size as Scotland and has produced 1% less oil and gas than Scotland. Norway's sovereign wealth fund today is worth £826 billion. That's a lot more than I am suggesting Scotland will be worth, because I have used the low revenues that the UK's mismanagement of Scottish oil and gas resources generated, not the mighty Norwegian ones. Over 38 years, the cost to Scotland of being part of the UK in monetary terms, if our government was almost as competent as Norway, is £1 trillion. That's the difference between what Norway would have done and what the UK did with our surpluses. That's £14.4 billion a year, or £1.2 billion a month. And people wonder why we have the second worst pension in the developed world and can't afford to pay more. The UK government causes 100% of Scotland's debt and 100% of its phony deficit, and then tells the people of Scotland that it can't afford to be independent. You can purchase your own copy of Scotland the Brief at www.businessforscotland.com.
IndyPram, yes, IndyPram on IndyLive.Radio.